Have you ever been betrayed by somebody close to you? Maybe it was a friend, maybe it was a family member, maybe it was an acquaintance, but you usually could trust them, you usually cared about them to a very high degree, and all of a sudden, they are out to get you. We're going to talk about exactly that concept in a little bit, but first, we're going to cover some of these other Psalms. Today on the podcast, we looked at Psalm 3-4, 12-13, 28, and 55.
So one specific psalm that really stuck out to me today was Psalm 4, and honestly it kind of just like was connecting with some other things that I have been processing throughout the day. So I was reading in John today the story of when Jesus turns the water into wine, and he is basically providing this miracle, but at the very tail end of the chapter in verse 25, it talks about how Jesus, like, he understands the heart of the people. And from that, I had to dig a little bit deeper, because like at first there was a correlation being made by someone else that I was listening to, that they were trying to make the point that like Jesus was man, so he understood them. But then I was like, no, I don't think that's totally right. So I dug a little bit further, and it was talking about how Jesus knew the hearts of men because he was God, and knew that, yes, he was like providing this miracle for them, but faith in and of itself needs to be more than just being wowed by miracles. Faith is much deeper than that. So when I was reading through this psalm today, it like immediately connected me back to that story. Verse 6 says, I should start by saying this. The title that was given to this chapter in our Bible, it says, "Answer me when I call." And I think this connects really specifically when we look at verse 6. So this is just like crying out, like, Lord, please answer me when I'm calling to you, when I'm asking for things. And verse 6 says, "There are many who say, 'Who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they when their grain and wine abound.'" So that's like so interesting to me, because it's like this call out for God to like grant, I don't know, whatever you desire, whether that be like financial signs that you feel like you need for something to make a decision. But our little footnotes say joy is not the result of those material things or signs, or in Jesus' case in that story, the miracles. It's like it's faith alone in Christ. And so that to me was just like, wow, okay, it's really cool how these connections are being made across the Testaments too, which is really cool, New and Old Testament. But yeah, that really just kind of made my mind just, I don't know, spiral and start thinking of all these connections, that our faith is so much more than just a fleeting miracle that we will more than likely forget. And we do it all the time. Ryan and I have been in some situations in our past where we were just like calling out to God for signs, and things definitely fell right into our laps at times. But it's so interesting how, I mean, we kind of forget about those things sometimes, and then just like almost demand God to like shine your face upon us, tell us what you want to tell us. But it's so much more than that. Just like that walking day by day faith in Christ alone.
There's a really interesting story in the Gospels where Jesus is telling a parable about a rich man. It's called The Rich Man and Lazarus. Mm-hmm. And Lazarus was a sick man that was laying at the rich man's gate his whole life. And then they both died at the same time.
Right.
And Lazarus goes to heaven, and essentially the rich man goes to hell. And there's this dialogue between the two of them. And the rich man who is in hell basically says to God, like, hey, please send Lazarus to my family and tell them that they should believe, because if Lazarus comes back from the dead and tells them that they should believe, they'll finally believe. Mm-hmm. And one of the takeaways from the parable, one of the things that Jesus explains through God in the story, is that if they have not believed the law and the prophets, they will not believe him. And the idea is, if you don't believe the word, if you don't believe what has already been revealed to you, most likely miracles are not going to bring you closer.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
So, I mean, if you're out for just miracles, your heart's in the wrong place. And that does seem to be what Psalm 4, one of the things. Psalm 4 is really sharp and really good. It's also very short, so you can read it pretty quickly. But Psalm 4 definitely alludes to the fact that if you're only joyful when God's filling your grain, it's not going to be enough. You need to be joyful in the Lord in plenty and in lacking, which is actually why Paul said he figured out the secret to all circumstances. He can be content in all things. So
That's so interesting too, because even you said filling their grain.
Yeah.
It's almost like present day to me is just like filling the demands that I ask of God. Like, do this and do it now.
Which is really
So
funny because if
interesting.
you're listening to the United States, you're already living in one of the most prosperous countries in all of human history. Like, we have many things, and yet our heart is such a pit that we just want more and more and more. So
sure.
we have most of the comforts that the world has to offer, and they still aren't enough.
What's that funny saying? If you don't learn from history, you'll never learn, or something
Yeah.
like that. It's kind of like a weird secular twist of this.
So essentially, the overall message of Psalm 4 is to have peace in all circumstances, because even when you're stressed and anxious, you can trust in God. You can pray to God. You can trust that he hears you, and you can remember the ways that he has provided for you in the past. And ultimately, you can have faith knowing that God has cared for you in the past. He's going to care for you in the present, and he will continue to care for you in the future. God did not bring you to where you are today. If this is resonating with you, God did not bring you to where you are today just to drop you off and laugh and be like, ha! Like, God's done some things for you. You know that's true. So continue to have faith that he will continue to work. I fall because God oftentimes does not work fast enough to my liking.
I was going to say, like, and to, like, I think of certain things in my life that I've got gripped really tightly. Like, truly, there are things that I'm like, well, if God takes this away, I don't know what I would do.
Yeah.
I think we all probably have those things in our lives that are just like, oh, yeah, I say this, but
Yeah.
what about this?
So, connected to that, Psalm 55 is another psalm that's very closely related to what you do when difficult things happen to you. But this particular psalm seems to address specifically what you do when somebody very close to you decides to betray you completely. It's interesting because we're doing this chronological reading. This particular psalm would resonate with David in the sense where Amnon and Absalom are fighting each other and fighting eventually David's kingdom altogether. These are his own sons that he has raised in his household, and they are rejecting him and fighting him.
Which psalm are you talking here? This is
Psalm 55.
55, okay.
And it seems like that is the situation at hand when he's writing this psalm. Another commentary suggests that this has to do with Jonathan, because it talks about his closest friend whom he had made a covenant with. The problem is there's not a lot of significant strife recorded between David and Jonathan, though a lot of time passed in their friendship, so we don't know necessarily what that looked like. It seems like this psalm is related to Amnon and Absalom.
Such names. I wonder if they're going to get a comeback.
I strongly doubt it. I know your favorite name from yesterday was Ahithophel.
Oh, I hated that. I could not say it.
So the idea of this psalm is, listen, when you're dealing with it, this is funny. It's like a broken record now with the psalms, but it's like, yeah, when you struggle with things, when you have things that are difficult, what are you supposed to do? Go to the Lord. Go to the Lord. Go to the Lord. It seems like so many of these psalms are different ways of saying basically go to the Lord. But that is the thing. I mean, Psalm 55 starts out in verse 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint and I moan because of the noise of the enemy. So he paints this picture of this terrible enemy and then gives you even more context towards the middle that it is actually this terrible enemy used to be my best friend. And verse 20, my companion stretched out his hand against his friend. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart.
Smooth as butter. Never thought you'd hear that in the Bible.
There you go. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. What a promise to keep in your heart when you're dealing with difficult things. I'm just reminded of how important it is to trust that you are righteous before God. Ultimately, we are righteous before God because of Jesus' atoning sacrifice, the fact that he gave his life to pay the debt for our sin. But there's kind of that like eternal righteousness that is living in the truth of Christ's sacrifice on our behalf. But I think there's also just like real world righteousness that we are called to be holy. And so when we are living a holy life, which we cannot do outside of Jesus, don't hear me saying some kind of legalistic nonsense, but when we are making good decisions and decisions that honor Jesus, that honor God with our lives, he does protect us and he does care for us and he does guard us. And so we know that we can cast our cares on the Lord because he has promised that the righteous will not be moved.
Mm-hmm. So circling back to Psalm 4 and also to Psalm 55 that Ryan was just talking about, I think a your part for today really goes along with what we were talking about throughout the episode, especially here in my footnotes. I just read this. I think it's really applicable to all of our lives. But it says, when thinking about Psalm 4, the psalm expresses quiet trust amid troubling circumstances. So I think something to encourage you all with today is no matter the circumstance that you are in, the trouble, it could be many different things, but those troubling circumstances that you are in, just remember to have that quiet trust in the Lord, knowing that just because we demand something from him, that's not necessarily how that relationship works, but just the quiet trust that he will work out his good plan in your life today. All right. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you guys back tomorrow.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.